Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'd first like to take the opportunity to recognise the enormous contribution of the Transport Accident Commission, not just to ECIS, but to making this day happen, and recognise Mr John Walter, Chair of the Board, and Mr Rob Nethercote, Board Member, CEO Joe Calafiore. Without their support, this study wouldn't happen and a day like this would not happen. And also like to thank Klaus and Anders and other speakers for coming today and giving of their time from overseas as well, and you'll hear from them later today, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming as well. I changed gear, and I always feared following someone like Klaus because as one of my PhD students, I always fear I'm travelling in his enormous wake. And I think that the principles that he spoke about can inspire and encourage us all to think much better about what we can achieve for our future and what mobility means and our health. So thank you, Klaus. In terms of setting the agenda a little bit for the rest of the day, really wanted to talk about what some issues are within Victoria and why serious injury is such a very significant issue and why we need to change gear and think about serious injury and think about all that that entails, because it can give the politicians, such as the Minister who was here, it's great to see that level of support, to give the evidence to make very difficult decisions, which are becoming more difficult because the gains are becoming a little bit harder and they're incremental, and we wonder about cost. But the sort of thing that I want to talk about is the representation of serious injury and how we in the community, or how the community recognises it. And I just draw this bubble graph, and I think it's instructive to think about the relative proportions, because it's easy to talk about a number, and that's how we have reported the road toll for very many years. And it then makes it difficult when the road toll is getting lower and every death is tragedy. But when we hear the rhetoric of the road toll is a record low or it's going down and the numbers, it starts to become very, very difficult. But it also does something a little bit sinister. It also completely fails to recognise that there's a very large consequence of the road transport system as it's currently designed. It fails to recognise that there are very severe consequences for people who are injured and some whose lives are changed forever. And the TAC plays a very significant role in Victoria in managing some of those people for the rest of their life. The boxes in the middle are the proportions of people who are in hospital for 14 days. And if you're in the Alfred Trauma System or the Royal Melbourne Hospital, one of the best trauma facilities in the world, for more than a week, you're in trouble. And this is the population in which we have, that happens on our roads. We see that there's about 18,000 people make a claim to the TAC every year. We see that 6,000 people are admitted to hospital, and of those 1,000 or so are in hospital for more than 2 weeks. That's how we can understand, but what does that actually mean, and what does our society and what do people in our road transport system think about? And how does their trade-off in how they don't think about or they're not aware of some of these things starts to become an issue in how to accomplish the next things in our system that might be a little bit difficult. And things like speed management becomes a very big challenge when the community doesn't understand and they don't see that. So this is the question. This is where it all begins, when at the end of the day everything goes wrong. And this is what the ECIS study is a little bit about. What is it that gets us to this point? And then what can the trauma services do to facilitate the patient and their recovery? Well, what do people think when they see a crash? What's the cause of the delay ahead? Gee, I hope they're okay. They look injured, but they'll be okay, they'll recover. I saw a horrific crash on the way home. The person looked in a bad way, but that's pretty much where it begins and ends for people, I think. And that starts to be a really significant problem because it becomes, as I say, very difficult for those more difficult decisions to sometimes be made in how we conceptualise our own risk and the things that government can do. Oops, sorry. What we see, and the graphic pictures are something that I think about, but sometimes words are just words, and sometimes pictures tell us a lot more. We don't leave home expecting or wanting to end up in a crash. We don't sometimes have a system, or we don't want the things that are required necessarily that might disrupt us just a little bit, that are complicated, to be done for various reasons. But life can have these profound changes very, very quickly. And for thousands, getting back on track is a very significant journey. And not everyone is the same. And the mental and physical health consequences can be the same. It can be very considerable and stay with people forever. And it's hidden. It's not hidden, though, for people who are involved, and it's not hidden, certainly, for the families as well. But we look at our system and we wonder about the trade-off that we're prepared to make and what we're not prepared to do, and why. This is a fundamental question. So the key road safety challenge is to change that gear, to make the conversation much broader, much bigger, much more about health, much more about our quality of life. Ultimately, we'll work towards zero. So ultimately, we want to eliminate crashes altogether. But there's another thing that's important to do, and that's to build a system that is, if a crash occurs, because we may not have the technology today, but it will come, as Klaus had said. Those things will come, or the public will be ready and be prepared. They will eventually come. But we have to mitigate the severity of the injuries. And in working towards those, we can't make value choices. He was drunk, wasn't wearing a seatbelt. We can't make those value judgments. At the end of the day, that's not what it's about. The first statement we ask is, this has to stop. The second question is, how? How? We've got the big things in Victoria, and Victoria's had enormous success in the road toll, looking at the number of people killed. Serious injury is a different story. But the question starts to be, what do we need to do, but how do we do it? What levers can we pull? How do we come back against community resistance to do some things? The question is, of course, what in the chain of events? Because the pictures tell us something. The pictures always show us the person in the car when it's all gone terribly wrong. But where do we intervene? And by intervening, it doesn't necessarily mean just at the roadside. It means intervention in the system, in the person, the car. And that's where we have to ask ourselves, what can we do? We look in our, we call a safe systems toolbox, or our countermeasure catalogue. You look in there and you pull some things out and you think speed, reduce speed limits, make sure people's wearing their seatbelts, you enforce, you put rumble strips. The toolbox is enormous in there. The countermeasure catalogue, you can flick through it. The question is, which ones are most cost effective? Which ones are doable today? And for what crash types? Because not all crashes happen in the same way, and what are the benefits? And then once we've done that, what do we have left? And how do we deal with what's left? And as we say, we might not have the answer now, but how do we prepare for the future? These are strategic policy decisions that need to be made today. So we need to understand what the nature of our crash is and what's left, because what we do today and what we think about will affect us very deeply tomorrow. So the ECIS study, entirely funded by the Transport Accident Commission, is purposely designed to identify all of those factors to document the opportunities for prevention of the crash itself, but also in reducing injury. And this is the safe system, and this is what we're trying to create. We're trying to create a situation where we can have lots of fail-safes. And I ask you, we look at aviation. We look at the things and say, aviation's really safe. but we're maybe not as prepared to have all of the fail-safes in our system as they do in aviation. And that's a really interesting thing, because we point to aviation and a jumbo jet. We would not accept them having multiple fail-safes. And yet we kind of do here in the road transport system. And I ask you why? Why are we as a community not prepared to have the multiple fail-safes? That things can be so porous, we have to patch them up in a patchwork quilt kind of way. It's a very interesting way of looking at it. And it's, as Klaus had said, it's the harder you get hit, the more you're going to hurt. It's pretty straightforward. And it's about protecting us as people, knowing that no one wants to leave home not to come home 2, 3, 4 weeks later. No one has that view. And this is what we're trying to do in the study. And I stick the box on the head of the driver because it's a mystery, but that's sort of where it all starts. So what we're trying to do by looking at our sample of 400 injured drivers who we're eternally grateful when they're going through the worst time in their lives to participate in our study to help us identify the next generation road safety solutions, is looking at what the precursors are. What are the upstream driver factors? What is it about that infrastructure? And what is it about the car and how is it performed? What are our successes and what are our failures? And sometimes some of what we find actually challenges our thinking. We have certain biases in the way we are. We think it's just all young drivers. I mean, when you say it's all about young drivers, it's dismissive. But what is it about that behaviour? What is it about being young? What is it about the situations that they put themselves in? That's the critical question. Same with someone who's a high-level drink driver. Do they have a health condition? Are they alcohol dependent? Because they get in the car and all of a sudden it becomes an issue where we might see someone who puts themselves in a situation that's very, very difficult for themselves and for other people. So we can never afford to demonise why people are in a crash. But we need the information, and sometimes the information does challenge us in the way we see things. And in the small number that we have so far that represents this information, because the study is ongoing, the size of these images reflects some of the factors that are factors in our overall sample. But I can tell you that the size of those words changes according to the crash type and who's involved. And we can see that, yes, fatigue is up there, but have a look, no airbags. 55, 60% of our young drivers in a car that's more than 15 years old. What does that say about the upstreaming of where we need to prevent injury? The crash might still happen, but the injuries will be a whole lot less severe. What does that tell us about driving policy? What does it tell us that we need to do? And some of emotional stress, mental health, everyday life. How do we then intervene at upstream ways and have a look at that? And what I will say is, when we look at this, we'll always say, 29% of crashes are due to fatigue, 25% of fatalities are due to someone with an illegal BAC. But this is much more than just that. It tells us very strategically, when we look forensically at each case, where we can intervene. And that's something that's really, really critical, because what the Minister said earlier was, we need the cover to be able to make those difficult decisions. We need the evidence. And ECIS is set up very deliberately to accomplish just that. And I will say we've done this. It's not just about statistics. As we search for it, the translation becomes really critical to demonstrate to the evidence-based, to give government and policymakers the very significant things, the power, to empower people, to empower the community to actually understand what's possible. Not just what's possible, actually, but what's necessary to be done. And it's not just one thing that we can work on many things concurrently. Some crashes may not exist in the future because of advances in vehicle technology, but that will take a long time. How do we intervene? How do we do things? And we actually used the Transport Accident Commission linked data, a piece of work that I did with the federal government. And we show that the power of driving innovation, development, making business case for policy decisions through what will be a new site impact rule in the United Nations Global Technical Regulation 14 was underpinned by the sort of data that we have. With ECIS, we're looking at one-to-many. How does our one isolated crash? Because the question starts to be, oh, well, Michael, you're looking at only 400 crashes. Well, I can tell you that's about a fifth to a quarter of all people in hospital for more than 14 days. The things that we find out is translatable, because what we also see is crashes in environments are very specific, and they happen time and time and time again. And that's the thing. Some of these are predictable in the way that they occur, and we're learning a lot more about that. And the data is really important simply because some things the community see as impossible, or it's too hard, or not even necessary, can be demonstrated as being actually eminently possible, doable, and justifiable. And that's the conversation that we need to have, and couch that in the consequences of serious injury. So what I would say is, in leading a small path to the speakers who follow me, we need to also reframe how we see injury crashes. It's an impact on life and health. That's what it's about. And that should change the way that we are prepared as individuals and as a community to actually think about how we need to invest and how we need to act. And it's certainly necessary as we move towards 2030 and the principles of the Sustainable Development Agenda, and our cities are stopping because there's so many cars, how vulnerable road users become very, very important to protect, as well as providing the best care for people. So what I would say is this: once who in this room and in the community is prepared to accept serious injury, especially when we will know the suite of fixes that we can work towards to get Victoria moving towards zero. I'd like to just leave that slide there to my acknowledgements. Thank you.